Um,
Hi, Nick. Nick, thank you so much for making yourself available. And you and I are going to have a rather spicy conversation about the power structures behind the shadows that are at play, shaping our world the way that it is. Before I do that, I just want to let people know we're recording this on Tuesday, 23rd of December at 6:37 a.m. in the UK. Do you want to start by introducing yourself, please?
Sure, Richard. Thanks very much for having me on. But I live in South Africa, in Cape Town most of the time. I'm away on vacation right now, but I live and work in Cape Town, where I run at daytime a private equity fund which invests in mid-sized businesses along very old school private equity lines, nothing like the modern iterations of private equity firms that pervade in the US and the UK. And then since a certain event in 2020, I started an organization that was providing, let's say, an alternative view to the standard approaches taken to managing that event. And that organization grew very rapidly and came to include a large number of dissident and skeptical voices around the world. The organization's name was PANDA, which was a portmanteau originally for pandemics data and analysis, although we very quickly moved on from that sort of definition into a much broader discussion about the setting in which that event was taking place. And by setting, I mean the kind of political and social factors that contributed to it. And since then I've been speaking a lot. I'm heavily engaged as a speaker at various conference events around the world, and I try to take a very broad view, leaning heavily on my professional qualification as an actuary, my day job as an investor, and my night job as a sudden dissident circa February 2020.
That's right. And I imagine somewhere in there you managed to be a husband and a father and all those sorts of normal things as well.
All of those things. I've had 4 children, 3 of whom are still alive, 3 boys who are aged 19, 17, and 10 months. I'm on my second marriage.
Okay.
That's very much the delight of my life.
That's fabulous. I saw that the way your face lit up when you said your fourth is 10 months old.
Yeah,
with evident. Okay, thank you, Nick. And the website is pandata.org, is that right?
Pandata.org, and my Twitter and Substack handles are the same. It's Nick Hudson, Nick Hudson CT for Cape Town. The same handle for both X and Substack.
Great, and I'll have all those links in the description below, and I do recommend people check Nick out. Now, Nick, in 2020, and in England where I am, it started in March 2020, there was a particular event and a particular way of dealing with a particular issue. And one of the consequences of that event is people got separated from each other, got atomized. That, because we were told to stay at home and not go out and not go and meet our grannies and stuff and wear masks in order to keep granny safe. And it was, for me, and I think for many, many others, it was a very anxiety-provoking episode. And one of the things that I appreciate how people like yourself and many others put your heads above the parapet and weren't afraid to speak out against the dominant narrative. And I want you to know that what you did, because I did follow some of your work during that period, what you did made a difference to me. And I think many, many others, and what you continue to do in exposing how our reality is being misshaped and distorted does make a difference to many, many people. And, because we're spreading an alternative perspective that leaves people empowered versus one which will leave people crushed and eventually genocided. So thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, and I think you're right in your analysis. I must say my life is not bereft of people saying thank you. The community of people who have appreciated the message and the fact that I and others have stood up, stuck our heads above the parapet, as you put it, is not a small one. And so it's also a very warm and courageous community, whereas our opponents are characterized by extreme cowardice, to the point of never being prepared to debate their perspectives to engage with people with a different view. They seek instead to censor and to cancel. And I've had all of that. I've had, professional misconduct complaints and unprofessional conduct complaints, and I've had people launching legal actions, and I've had assaults on my business, and I've had spies parked outside my office window. There really has been a relentless kind of campaign. Media smear articles, you name it, shadow banning, censorship. It's been a relentless story, and that tells you a lot about the lack of character and the lack of courage of the people we're arrayed against.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm just getting my notebook so I can take notes, because I found that
No problem.
very useful. Okay, no, thank you so much. And it is that the whole issue of censorship is one that favors the powerful, because it's only the powerful that have the sense. You and I, unfortunately, can't censor our tyrannical governments, much as we may want to, right? Or just tell them, shh, stop it, right? But they have the power to censor us, and that censorship always favors the powerful and the authoritarian. Okay, so I mentioned earlier at the beginning how we're going to talk about how reality is being distorted, and the fact that you've had these attacks on you does suggest you're rather a dangerous man, Nick, for the tyrants that want to rule over us.
There was an interesting event in, I think, 2020. It was late 2020 when a local Soros-controlled newspaper called the Daily Maverick had published an article, a smear article against me, and one of the co-authors was this British guy. He was co-authoring with a well-known, if very disreputable, South African journalist by the name of Rebecca Davis. And this fellow was the co-author. And when I did a little bit of scratching, what came up very quickly was that he had intelligence community links. And that caused me to really sit up and take notice, because it meant a couple of things. Censorship and smearing efforts are never directed at people who are speaking nonsense. They're worried about people who are speaking the truth. Censorship is always aimed at the truth tellers. And the fact that they went to the trouble of, we're talking about an international level intelligence community asset writing this article, meant that I was on the right track. I was right. That was the first thing it meant to me. And the second thing that it meant to me was that I was obviously having an impact, because there was a need for them to take this rather extreme measure. So they do give the game away. It's not the case that we're entirely incapable of censoring them. We do have the choice of not giving the narratives our attention. And I think that's a much more powerful technique than people really appreciate. You can extend that. Just think about how you would not give the narrative attention, or where does the narrative get its resources to promote itself? The narrative gets its resources very often from the large corporations. These are the guys who support these dastardly organizations like the World Economic Forum and so on, who are the subscribers and partners of these organizations. And simply by spending less of our resources on the goods and services of large corporations, we could all do an incredible amount of damage to these evil narratives, and that's what they are. They're evil. So if we could get a large number of people to substantially reduce their expenditure on the goods and services of large corporations, they would very quickly be hobbled, because they are typically overgeared, bloated, inefficient, and I don't think it takes much to bring them to their knees and to cut the funding for these organizations off at the root.
Right, and then moving to alternative, local, decentralized, perhaps dissident structures instead, including, I would say, this channel, although it's in a large corporation. You can also find me on ODYSEE and Rumble, and spreading this sort of information, including also spreading the sort of information that you do through pandata.org, and also on your Substack, and also on your X. And you were recently did an interview with Neil Oliver. And I was on Neil Oliver a few days previous to you, and one of the things I was talking about then was the notaxforwar.com, No Tax for War, which is based in England, which is a system whereby people can legally, lawfully withhold their taxes as a protest against what this government are doing. So please go and check that out. Now, in your article, one of your Substack articles, there was a speech that you gave talking about the distortion of reality, and I do recommend people read that, because that was kind of like, oh, that decided me. I gotta interview Nick one-on-one, because we're trying to work out for you to come on with another one of the guests on mine, right?
Yeah.
We're not going to say who it is because it's not confirmed yet. But I wanted to interview you one-on-one about this and then see where that takes us. So do you want to start with that? How is reality being distorted?
Yeah, well, so first of all, just a little bit about the talk and then the conversation with Neil. The talk was delivered at a live event. I wasn't on a Zoom screen or a Teams screen. It was a real analog in-person event. Wow. in beautiful Cape Town. And it was the 40th anniversary event of the Libertarian Seminar in South Africa, with some quite big name speakers. So from the United States, there was Senator Rand Paul and the very spicy Kentucky Congressman Thomas Massey. So it's a fairly significant event with some, highly regarded people in the audience, intellectuals and public speakers of quite some repute. So it was a very exciting invitation. But as I sat down to try and write out a talk, I became frustrated with the extent to which I was self-censoring because of my perceptions about that audience. And I in the end, kind of tossed it up and decided I was going to do a no-holds-barred presentation, just with no regard to the Overton window. I was going to write The World According to Nick Hudson in a 20-minute speech. And so I did that. I didn't hold myself back at all. And I was thinking, as I was looking at the audience up there, oh, I've made a mistake. This is going to really spook them. It's going to be too much. But as the talk went on, I could see people sitting up in their chairs and paying attention. And then I was extremely surprised to find that, amongst a really great speaker lineup, that my talk was voted by the audience best talk of the 2-day seminar, which had probably about 20 speakers. And that caused me to really think about what that meant, because I'd made the assumption incorrectly that this would simply be too much for most of that audience to digest. And I also had the opportunity, because it was a live event, there were dinners and coffees and so on around the talks, to engage with the audience and to find out how they experienced it, what their thought process was. But that gives you the sort of setting for what was happening. And then a couple of interesting things happened in the aftermath of the event. I first put out a couple of summaries. That in fact the summaries, some of them had been out before the event even happened, and then I put the full text of the talk out, and that went pretty viral despite the shadow banning on social media. People were cutting it out of the Twitter post and sending it around on WhatsApp. And I had that thing happen where, Nick, you should read this talk. It's a fantastic talk. You'll love it. And I'd write back to the guy and say, yes, they cut my name off. That's my talk. So it started really being circulated very widely. And then people started asking me to be interviewed about the talk, one of which was this interview by Neil Oliver, which was published 2 days ago on YouTube, on GB News Online, and which has already had 220,000 views in those 2 days. Wow. Despite the fact that it's almost impossible to find on the GB News website, and it's up on YouTube. In the past, whenever I've had several videos that have gone viral and then been summarily deleted by YouTube. So not too sure how long it's going to be up there, but at the moment it's still being viewed at a very healthy clip of about 5,000 views an hour, which for a 50-minute video is not too shabby. So there you have it, this sort of unexpected and surprising turn of events in a talk that summarized the state of the world, and which, as you correctly say, started off by saying, and I'm going to just actually quote because I can't put it better than I wrote it, distortion of reality by tightly controlled media and highly censored social media and by actor politicians has become so intense that most people have disconnected from reality on many dimensions. Democracy has long been dysfunctional, with manipulation of electoral results and control of candidates for election making a mockery of democratic processes, and the roles of unelected officials coming to dominate those of the elected ones. In this environment, vast and completely fabricated narratives have been successfully launched upon unsuspecting populations. So that was the setup. And I then mentioned 6 fabricated narratives. Obviously, the world of fabricated narratives is not limited to 6. There are a great many, but those were the 6 big ones that I chose to mention. I don't think there's any point in going through them in detail because people can find what I have to say about each of those narratives, the health-related ones and the weather-related ones elsewhere, refugee crises and publicized wars and trans rights and central banking were the other ones. We don't need to go into the detail of them. And I went on to say it does not matter whether the situation reflects planning on the part of a shadowy elite or is emergent from the decline of your civilization. No matter whom you vote for or what gloss your preferred candidate puts on these issues, nothing will change until you and enough of the people around you wake up to reality and launch a campaign of consistent non-compliance with the anti-human trajectory that manipulative elites have set us upon. So that was the sort of the setup for a talk that then went on to explore the nature of the power structures that give rise to these fabricated narratives.
Okay. And before we started recording, so what we're going to talk about is, so we have these fabricated narratives over the last few years, and then there's those that operate these fabricated narratives.
Yeah.
You mentioned the intelligence community and also the central banking system. So we could talk about that and we'll go that way. But I'm going to say to you, Nick, there's a lot more than these 6. So
sure.
For example, my 18-year-old and my 21-year-old never went to school. And one of the reasons why they never went to school is I got curious about why the British brought schools to India, to British India, because empire wasn't a philanthropic exercise. So why they're bringing schools there got me interested in that. And then recently I've been covering on my channel through people like Susan Kokinda from Promethean Action and Alex Trainer about the American system of political economy, which has been completely obscured and disappeared from our economics books. It's just, I got a nephew who's doing business studies, doesn't it, at SOAS in London. He doesn't know anything about it. I don't know anything about it. So there's these distortions go much, much deeper and much, much further. And I'm saying this for people to bear this in mind, because what's happening is that the current structures, I think the fiat currency system is on its last legs, and all the structures that it's built up are crumbling, and people are beginning to see what's really, really going on as all these structures crumble. And the people at play running all of this is what Ian Burlingame refers to as the Praetorian Guard, the security for the central banking system, which brings us to the intelligence community and Operation Gladio.
Yeah, well, yeah. So you're correct in pointing out that there are a lot of organizations. It's actually quite, the spectrum of organizations that are involved at some level of the implementation or enforcement, we should maybe call it, of this kind of very dystopian vision of the world, is large. There are interlocking organizations with overlapping membership and ambitions. They might vary with respect to a certain area of concern or geographic emphasis. But, we all know their names: the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, the Council for Foreign Relations, Chatham House, the Bilderberg Society or Bilderberg Organization, the Fabian Society, the central banks. But all of those organizations are kind of downstream of a control structure that gives this network the ability to coordinate and to implement its policies in global lockstep, as we saw in 2020. And since then, it's been very visible in other domains. For example, in the way in which the Ukraine conflict was portrayed. This idea that sort of Vladimir Putin woke up one morning, got up on the wrong side of the bed and just randomly decided to invade Ukraine, as opposed to responding to a couple of decades of encroachment and increasingly offensive moves by effectively the United States acting through its proxy NATO. And so I think you're right in saying that around the world, the number of people who are wise to these narratives has swelled enormously over the recent years. A lot of people who hadn't been paying attention before 2020 are now paying a great deal of attention. And I think that's part of the reason why we see and experience this kind of rush to implementation of a great many elements of the global technocratic surveillance state that is clearly being, or what is clearly desired to be ushered in certain quarters. And so above this network of implementers, there seem to be two that sort of stand out in terms of their ability to control all the other organizations and to influence the other organizations. And those are, as you correctly said, the intelligence community, and then the second one is the Bank for International Settlements, which is an organization that most members of the public have never heard about. And it's my thesis that above the two of those, there is an opaque power structure and a common power structure about which we know very little detail and about which it is very hard to obtain incremental detail. And the important thing to say about the intelligence community, or at least my thesis about it, is that I think it's been many, many decades since that intelligence community actually acted in the interests of its sponsor nations. So, for example, the CIA, I don't believe acts in the interests of America or in the interests of American citizens. And I don't believe that it is really independent of the other big hairy ones, the MI6 in the UK and Mossad in Israel. Of course, people will very quickly say, oh, you should also mention the other members of the Five Eyes, as they're called, which is the sort of Anglophone intelligence community consisting of the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. And I would readily say, yes, those other organizations are there, but they are relative pea shooters compared to the CIA, MI6, and Mossad. And so my thesis is that this intelligence community has long since become an effectively criminal organization that doesn't act unless it's convenient for them to do so in the interests of the sponsor state, and it's effectively emerged criminal entity. And it's normally when I say something like that, I lose half my audience, and that is why in that talk I introduced the story of Operation Gladio. Now, Operation Gladio is actually a fairly unexceptional event in the sense that there are a great many, let's call them PSYOPs and operations by intelligence community organizations that are horrifying.
Hold on a second. Forgive me for interrupting. Before we go into Operation Gladio, I just want to say, so if people are still, if you are no longer listening, if you've left the video now, then please leave a comment in the description below or click on the like button, right, if you've left. If you haven't left, well, let us know as well, right? Right. And just on the CIA. So one recent example, and then we can go to Operation Gladio, is how the CIA conspired to bury the story of the Hunter Biden laptop and thus interfered in the 2020 election because they came up with this nonsense story that it was a Russian plot. It was Russian disinformation, when actually it was very, very real and exposed Joe Biden's corruption and his son's corruption, how they were working hand in hand in Ukraine to do all sorts of nefarious activities, including enriching themselves. Okay.
Yeah, so an important thing to note there is that there used to be laws in the statutes which prevented the government from lying to and propagandizing the citizenry of the United States. And Obama dispensed with those laws during his administration. And of course, Donald Trump has done nothing to reassert them. So yes, and this is just a classic example. How could it possibly be in the interests of the citizens of the United States to have truth obscured?
Yeah.
But yeah, and so your example is a very apt one. But the reason Operation Gladio makes sense as an example for me is that it is one of the very few PSYOPs that has been officially acknowledged. And so even Wikipedia, that completely distorted and highly misrepresentative creator of fabricated narratives, even Wikipedia's entry on Operation Gladio does actually contain a substantial subset of the truth, which is that when the end of the Second World War came to pass, the United States left tens of thousands of operatives in Europe. And those operatives set about launching a number of destabilization events, including assassinations of political leaders. The sitting head of state of Italy was assassinated by Operation Gladio operatives. And terrorism events, like the Bologna train station bomb.
Nick, hold on, sorry. Who was the Italian prime minister and when was he assassinated?
Mori. It was in the 70s, I want to say. I think it might have been 1972, if I'm not mistaken.
No, I do remember the terror campaign in the 1970s, the bombings and everything. I was much, much younger, but I do remember it sort of happening and hearing about it. But you're saying it went back to the end of the Second World War, which would have been what? President Roosevelt.
Yeah, so I mean, the operation was established in 1945, and it was only officially, and some would say theoretically, terminated by George Herbert Walker Bush in 1990, pursuant to several revelations that had come about as a result of court cases in Europe. And it was interesting because you'd think that this would create waves, but what I believe it's indicative of is the extent to which, even when you go back 35 years to 1990, media was already controlled, and controlled in no small measure by the intelligence community itself. But as I mentioned in the talk, I think one of the reasons that George Bush Sr. was okay with disbanding Operation Gladio is that by then the intelligence community had become adept at operating through what are known as cutout organizations. Now, what the reason it needs to do this is there are laws on the books in the United States that prevent the CIA from certain types of foreign engagement, from undertaking certain types of foreign engagement. And what we have instead of the CIA taking direct actions is a series of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that are heavily infiltrated by current and former operatives of the intelligence community. So a classic example that I mention in my talk is the National Endowment for Democracy, which is ostensibly an NGO that's there to help you get democracy in your country if we think you need it, that kind of story. Well, Victoria Nuland, who was, what was she? Was she Assistant Secretary of State, or so she had some kind of relatively senior position that saw her becoming, intricately involved in the Ukraine regime change events that were precursors to the Ukrainian conflict. What's happened to her? Oh, she's just popped up the other day as a director of the National Endowment for Democracy. And so they've almost stopped pretending. You can see the links between the intelligence community and these fuzzy-sounding organizations like USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy very clearly. It doesn't take a brain surgeon to establish that they're there or to verify that they're there. But I think the reason the CIA didn't need its own operation, and I can't remember how exactly it was structured, whether it was sort of chain of command went through the Department of Defense or not, but the reason the CIA didn't need its own structure in Europe is it already had a global one in the form of these cutout organizations.
Right, okay. But who was behind the decision for the CIA for these operatives to be left behind in Europe? And why? And what have they been working on?
So, this is where the power structure becomes opaque. It's clear that there's a large amount of coordination going on, and coordination doesn't happen in a vacuum. We don't get events like the global rollout of lockdown and these narratives being salted in every single newspaper in every language around the world without there being a substantial amount of organization. I think there is always an element of society that is emergent. We speak about fashions and trends. And so emergence is a real thing. But I think it takes an act of incredible self-delusion to imagine that these major and highly articulated events, highly organized events, are simply the manifestations of a zeitgeist or a global psyche. It's clear by their consistency, the ruthlessness of their application, the extent to which they are heavily resourced, that there is a great deal of planning and organization going underway. And we can also see the damn plans. Some of them go back 100 years. The Fabian Society is a rich source publications detailing how the Anglo-American establishment, in effect, had in its midst people who believed that the world ought to proceed along the path of a Fabian evolution, which is to say, by implementing centralization at a global level and by means of a gradualist approach that slowly whittled down resistance and enfeebled the institutions that should be standing up against that kind of global centralization, call it, or socialism, because it's the Fabian socialist society we're talking about. So you can see that there's a long history of development of these centralizing ambitions, including articulations of the programs of implementation and the articulations of how to go about infiltrating and undermining judiciaries and media and healthcare organizations, and, as you correctly pointed out, the education establishment. I mean, your judgment was very good, and your observation that the British wasted no time in bringing schools to India is quite correct. And the reason for that is schools are an important element of indoctrination. And what do we see when it comes to schools worldwide? Yeah, the articulation of a global framework for education at the hands of UNESCO, a UN organization that leads to us shipping into our education syllabi and into the training of teachers these false narratives.
Yeah.
And so our children grow up with these false narratives. We grew up with false narratives.
Yes. Yeah, well, some, I suppose, I think it's got much worse, because I did learn about carbon dioxide and photosynthesis when I was at school. And in my job as a social worker, I go to schools regularly, and that's not what they're teaching about carbon dioxide.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, so the power structures behind this remain opaque. And I just want to remind people, I did an hour-long interview with Matt Errett about the Fabian Society and the roots and the history of the Fabian Society, and I do recommend people go and check that out if you want to look into that. So we don't know. Structures are opaque. These shadowy organizations that aren't publicized, largely because they also run the mainstream media. But then what's the outcome that these operatives, what was the outcome in 1945? That's okay, we're going to keep these thousands of intelligence assets in Europe in order to produce a certain outcome. What was that certain outcome then? And how has it shown up now?
Well, the official version of the narrative around Operation Gladio is that those operatives were there to guard against the encroachment of communism. But I believe that that's an incorrect emphasis, especially seeing that the techniques and trajectory of this intelligence community these days is quite difficult to separate from communism. It is a different thing from communism. Technocracy and the surveillance state is not, identical to communism, but it does share a number of features, including its tendency towards centralization at a gross level. So, that was the ostensible reason for the organization being there in the first place. In terms of the consequences of its evaporation, I would imagine that a large number of the operatives had reached retirement age long since, and so there was probably a self-liquidating aspect to the story, and as I say, a successor in the form of the cutout organizations. But there are things which I think we can say about the supervening organizational structure, and we are in the domain of a degree of speculation, but let's call it informed speculation. Let's say we are responding to the evidence in front of us, which is not entirely clean evidence. It's somewhat conflicting from time to time, and it's not ordered and served up on a platter. The books that one must read in order to get a glimpse of what's going on are large in number, sometimes hard to get your hands on. Definitely not promoted and marketed into your friendly local Amazon, but what can we say? It's my strong opinion that that it's a mistake to go down the path of animating this power structure with the characteristics of a particular faith or ideology. I think the criminality is the first and most important aspect to develop on. And criminals are, in essence, people who are without scruples and who do not cleave to ideology except where it's convenient for the purposes of advancing their interests. So I think it's best to think of this supervening control architecture as being willing to exploit whatever faith or occult belief system. It finds convenient, willing to exploit them and willing to manipulate people who adhere to those kinds of ideologies and belief structures. But I think we are dealing with a completely amoral mass that is kind of interested in control for control's sake, and the amassing of wealth for wealth's sake. They're not people who are motivated by deeply held adherence to Satanism or Zionism or whatever, as many people would hold. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is there is a continuity to it. And I had mentioned the phrase, the Anglo-American establishment, and I think it's still a workable phrase. It's possibly reached its sell-by date because the sphere of influences has expanded dramatically, and I'm sure that there are powerful members, if you like, who are not of Anglo-American progeny or origin. But I think that is a fairly useful placeholder that describes a cooperative that has proximity and access to these two elements, the one which we've discussed a lot at the moment, which is the intelligence community, and the other one which we haven't discussed at all, which is the Bank for International Settlements. And so I think that this Anglo-American establishment is a good name. I sometimes use the phrase parasitic elites, and I like that one as well, because these people are extractive, they are parasites. And I do sometimes hesitate at using the term elite, because it may be a compliment. Some people may perceive it as a compliment, but I don't. I'm enough of a sort of a localist and dissident to regard the term elite as having entirely negative valence.
Yes. Obnoxious people who are out to exert power and control and ruin the lives of those that they want to lord it over. And
yes, and actually one of the things, I've had a fairly long business career. It's 30 years spent mostly in South Africa, but a significant spell in New York, and shorter spells in the UK and Switzerland, all of it inside the financial services industry. I broke free of the world of the large corporation about a dozen years ago, setting up my own firm, which was the most important reason why I was able to speak out, because I don't have any controlling shareholders or funders who can tell me what to say and what not to say and what to do and what not to do. I have a very independent existence. But I've spent 30 years in an industry and built up an enormous network, both domestically and abroad. And that network and set of acquaintances has included multiple billionaires. Of all the billionaires I've met, there was only one that I actually liked. And it's led me to sort of regard them as people who become corrupted by their own success. I think a lot of these extremely wealthy people are themselves actually creatures of the intelligence community, and I'm talking here about people like Zuckerberg and Musk and what's his name, Altman, the guy and Larry Ellison and so on. These guys are very, their early careers are so intertwined with the intelligence community that you can't think of them as being really self-created men. And so, what the conclusion I came to is that, if we put aside the extremely wealthy cases where there is this sort of element of them being constructs, the constructs of this controlling intelligence community, and we look at let's call it the pavement variety billionaire. What I saw in those people is the extent to which they become divorced from ordinary people is quite extreme, and it happens quite quickly. And there's almost a culture among billionaires that helps them to set up a perimeters around them, so that the outside world of all these the great unwashed, doesn't get access to them. It's often held out to them in the form of private security. They spend an enormous amount of money on security, and that security apparatus, in part, acts to insulate them from normal people and, in general, from people who disagree with them. And so they have this kind of dual thing going on, where they are, at the same time, losing their familiarity with human life in the round, and also cutting off the mechanism of error correction, which is criticism. And so they start to occupy a very distorted reality. I have a friend who actually was quite involved at a senior level in the Gates Foundation. And he didn't last there for very long. It was several years. And what he reported to me was that a large amount of the foundation's money was spent on consultants. And what he noticed when he worked with these consultants is that almost all their effort went into working out what Bill Gates wanted to hear. And then a much smaller portion of the effort went into working out how to deliver the result he was looking for. And so there you have a situation where the world of Bill Gates is actually institutionally designed, whether by accident or intent. The world of Bill Gates is institutionally designed to cause his perception to part from reality, to decohere. And I think this is true to some or other extent for almost all billionaires. As I said, there is one who I regard as being, pretty close to being beyond reproach. He's a close friend of mine, and he's a person who I think has managed to keep his head screwed on and to stay in touch.
Yeah,
but with some difficulty, I'll add.
Now, what you said about consultants and billionaires makes absolute sense. If you imagine a scenario where you, Nick, are this multi-billionaire, and I'm a consultant, well, of course, what I want to do is generate more income for myself. It's how I provide for my family, and keep my head afloat, and also so I can have a nice yacht, not quite as large as your super yacht, Nick. Right? But then, I'll tell you what you want to hear, so you engage me more, and I make more money, and then I can buy myself a slightly bigger yacht, not still as big as yours, right? So then, yeah. and all these other people competing with me, all these other consultants competing in order to get your business.
Look, I mean, the old school private equity work that I mentioned, there's actually a lot embedded in that little phrase, old school. And one of the elements is we used to in private equity, and I still do, pay a huge amount of attention to incentives. And one of the consequences of that is that we never use consultants. It's become completely normal in the modern iterations of private equity out there in the wild for the utilization of consultants to become built into their processes. So it's not that they never use them, it's that they never don't use them, and they implement these, they get the consultants to come up with these 100-day plans, how they're going to change the company now that they've bought it. I take exactly the opposite view. There are no consultants utilized in my private equity firm, and we don't intend to change the business ourselves. We create an alignment situation with a talented management team and take away the huge wrapper of restrictions and inhibitions to sound decision making and corporate growth, and that is a very healthy, I'm talking about financially healthy approach. We have had a very good run of great performance in the mid-sized businesses that we require by doing the opposite of what most private equity firms do. And so to me, the reason you don't hire consultants is their payoff structure has nothing to do with yours.
Yes. Well, Nick, that's all very well and good for you and your firm, but it doesn't do any benefit to the consultant industry or for the intelligence assets that are masquerading as consultants or in the pay of the intelligence community in order to shape the world so that we are all happy owning nothing and eating crickets. I mean, it's so selfish of you, Nick, to disregard.
Look, let me actually make the point a little bit more solidly. I think the entire consulting industry is a charade. I mean, there are very few examples of, and I think they exist in narrowly niche specialist research fields. So if you're trying to build some kind of complicated industrial facility, the type of expertise you need is probably not available on a full-time basis. You don't need it on a full-time basis, and it probably sits in the heads of a handful of people around the world, and you need to get those people to work for you on a temporary basis. Obviously, that kind of consulting is healthy, needed, 100% okay. But the vast majority of consulting that goes on is really the work of gift of the gab generalists with flashy Ivy League credentials who are experts in PowerPoint and bamboozling people. And that entire industry, the world would be much better off without.
Yes, and the vast majority of consultants, and I see that in the local authority where I work as a social worker. In fact, all the local authorities that I work in, they have these consultants or these organizations that have sprung from consultants that are shaping local authority strategies and actions to reflect certain agendas that are part of the Agenda 2030. And I want to take it back to 1945 and what they were in service of, these operatives. And you mentioned it, which is building this surveillance technocratic control system, which includes, I assert, in an assertion, organizations like the European Union, the BIS,
like what, sorry?
The European Union,
yes,
the United Nations, the World Health Organization, all these supranational organizations that allow them to take hold of national governments and thus bypass democracy. Because the problem that the elites have, the uber elites with yachts bigger than yours, Nick, they, assuming you have one, you may just have a little
no, I'm a great adherent to playing with other people's toys.
All right, okay.
I've got enough friends. That, and I'm certainly not in the domain of being able to afford a super yacht. Let's dispel that rumor right now.
Right. Well, perhaps your swimming goggles and swimming trunks, given that you're in South Africa, right?
Yeah, my water wings are in impeccable condition now.
That they, I forgot my point, because democracy is messy, and Democrats, people will vote the wrong way. So then, what they did in Italy, and I do remember this, is that the MI6, CIA, and the Italian intelligence services, they blew Italian people up in order to blame it on the communists, on the Italian nascent communist movement. So here you have the intelligence community killing their own, working with foreign intelligence communities in order to kill their own, to delegitimize this movement.
So I think it's worse than that. I think the story of that they were fighting communism is a nice little bit of glossy wrapping paper. They were acting to undermine Europe in general. They were acting to polarize society in general. And so I think, we don't know the full story of all the operations, but I would put a wager a large sum of money is that if the truth came out, you would find that they were polarizing on multiple domains. You would find them on both sides of any number of kinetic and psychological conflicts or social conflicts. So they might be on both the side of radical Islam and radical Zionism. They might be on the side both of communism and anarchism, or of fascism and civil liberties. They might have been sponsoring events that simply caused people to be polarized along a number of dimensions and decide societies to decohere. I think the kind of infiltration that you mentioned of institutions was also part of the story. I mean, you've got allied to the Fabian in the United Kingdom. You've got allied to the Fabian Society, a very creepy organization called Common Purpose. There are no solid lines linking those two organizations together, but there very definitely are dotted lines in the form of shared membership at a senior level and programs that look very much the same. But Common Purpose is very much the kind of propaganda wing, if you like, what reads as the propaganda wing of the Fabian Society. And what did it do? It infiltrated institutions of a dazzling variety, from schools and municipal bureaucracies to the police and fire stations, and all sorts of people suddenly began to get training that was conducted along the lines of Common Purpose's ostensible worldview. And I think actually the United Kingdom, I would guess that it is the most such infiltrated nation on the planet.
Yes, well, it does have the oldest, not the oldest central bank, but certainly the most powerful central bank, because the Sweden central bank predated the Bank of England, but you had the Bank of England being incorporated in 1694, and all the incredible wealth that they accumulated during the days of British Empire by lending out money and then taking a return on the investments for these explorers that terrorized and extracted resources from other nations. But I draw parallels. You use your background in actuary work and investing in companies, that model of analyzing the world. One of the ways that I look at it is as a child protection social worker through forms of abuse at a fractal level. That people might think, no. that the intelligence services, the CIA, rather naive people might think, wouldn't do stuff like that. No, people are nasty. People are really, really nasty. And they will do really, really nasty things in order to further their own self-interest. Like, for example, the British killing 20 million Indians, or the Belgians killing 6 million Congolese during when they roamed over those countries. But also the fractal level, where you have these organizations like Common Purpose using propaganda. Also, we could consider it grooming people as a pretense, as a cover for the nefarious activities that they're actually engaged in behind the curtains. And Nick, I just really, really appreciate the peek that you've given us behind the curtains about what's really going on. Anything you want to say before we finish up?
I do like to end on a positive note, and not because I think that that's doing somebody a favor, but because I think that action is required and much more readily contemplatable today than ever before. So I just want to encourage people to undertake acts big and small of non-compliance. We mentioned the ability to direct your own expenditure away from the global behemoths. I mentioned your ability to divert your attention away from the salient stories, just the ones that are allowed to explode on social media. Those are all there to distract and manipulate, regardless of their truth content, which I think is overall pretty limited. So divert your attention, divert your money, and just carry on plugging away at people. You can learn how to talk to people who are not sighted, who are not in a position, whether it's psychically, emotionally, or intellectually, to begin to perceive reality in an accurate way. There are ways of speaking to them that are not confrontational, much more likely to move the needle. And so don't give up in that campaign. Just keep going. I think there's the reason for this rush to implementation that we're seeing is not because they have a magical belief in the importance of 2030 as a date, but because they realize that there's a force working against them that is gathering momentum.
Absolutely. And their structures are falling apart. They're running out of money. The debt overload is becoming too great. So they have to move quicker and quicker and quicker so they can put this feudal technocratic system of CBDCs and digital IDs and biometric wallets in order to control us before it all collapses. But as they move quicker, there's more and more resistance. And one of the things, excuse me, that definitely works in the United Kingdom, and it may work in South Africa, because South Africa has a common law tradition. South Africa is likely to be signed up to international conventions against genocide and terrorism, and may have passed legislation onto the domestic law book that reflects those. So in Britain, it's a criminal offense to give any organization any money that is used in violation of the International Criminal Court Act and the Terrorism Act. It's a criminal offense, and the government, local and central government agencies, aren't exempt from the provisions of those statutes. So by paying tax, I'm breaking the law in the United Kingdom. And go to notaxforwar.com and you can find out more about that. And if anybody who's a lawyer or whatever, or legally trained in South Africa, go and take a look and see in your own statutes. Nick, absolutely fabulous talking to you. I'd love to have you back on again. Really, really appreciate you taking the time. I'll have the links to your X and your Substack, and also pandata.org in the description below. Please do check out Nick's work, and share, subscribe, comment, like, all that business. This is Richard Nick signing out. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.